Good afternoon. I'm Carlos Fernandez, Policy Analyst at the Vegas Chamber. I'd like to thank you all for tuning into the Federal Hearing on Workers' Comp and Limited Liability, featuring representatives from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Black and LoBello, Cragin and Pike, Henderson Chamber of Commerce, Vegas Chamber President Beth Sewald. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to explain some features of this call. In order to preserve high sound quality, we'll be muting everyone on the line besides our presenters to make it easy for everyone to hear. If you'd like to ask a question, there are a few ways you could do so. If you're joining this call on the web and through the mobile app, you can ask a question by using the chat feature on the interface. We'll ask a question on your behalf. You can also ask a question by clicking the hand raise button on the interface. We'll call your name and unmute your line so you can ask a question. Once you have asked your question, we'll remute your line so everyone on the call can hear the answer. In order to preserve time, we ask that you please keep questions brief, and we'll be taking all questions at the end of the call. Now, please welcome the Vegas Chamber President and CEO, Beth Sewald.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you to all of our businesses and friends from throughout the entire state of Nevada who are joining us today on our conference call regarding limited liability and workers' comp. I'd also like to send a special thank you and welcome to our friends at the Henderson Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Scott Muelrath. Scott, thanks for being here today. Glad to have you.
Thank you, Mary Beth.
Yes,
pleasure.
Sir. Great, thank you. The Vegas Chamber has been working hard with our leaders throughout the entire state of Nevada and also on a federal level to bring businesses the very latest in information that they need to know. And our priority has definitely been to help our businesses protect yourselves and protect your employees' jobs as well. For those who do want to participate in these webinars, but you're not a member of the Chamber, keep in mind that we are giving away free memberships, temporary memberships throughout the month of June. So feel free to give us a call or check out vegaschamber.com for your free membership so that you can take part in these valuable webinars and all the resources that we have to offer at the Vegas Chamber. We do have a couple more opportunities that you might be interested in joining us for this week. It's the third in a four-part series of going back to work with Matter Real Estate, and this particular session will be dealing with fear in re-entering the workplace. So if that's something that's on the top of your mind, or if it's even come up at all, you're definitely going to want to join us on Thursday for that. And then on Friday, we're honored to have Governor Steve Sisolak. He is joining us on the latest on his Nevada roadmap to recovery, exclusively, and that one with Governor Sisolak is coming up Friday. Again, you can register for any of these webinars at vegaschamber.com. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our guest today, again, talking about limited liability workers' comp. We have two gentlemen from the U.S. Chamber, Mr. Marc Feedman, Mr. Matthew Webb. We also have the president of Cragin and Pike. He's also the chairman of the Vegas Chamber. Mr. Tom Burns is with us today. And then also joining us is Jim Wadhams. He's a partner of Black and LoBello. So thank you all, gentlemen, for joining us today. Marc, let's go ahead and start with you, Mr. Feedman. You are the Vice President of the Employment Policy Division for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Marc is responsible for developing and advocating for the Chamber's response to OSHA matters, the Employee Free Choice Act, the Family Medical Leave Act, and mandated leave issues, and then other labor and workplace issues as well. Marc, thank you so much for joining us on the call today. We're very glad to have you.
Good to be here.
You can go ahead and start to make your opening remarks if you wouldn't mind, please, sir.
All right, great. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I guess I'm going to cover a little bit of the workers' comp space, and then I'll let my colleague Matt Webb handle the liability discussion. I know Matt's been doing a ton of work in that area, so I'm sure he's got some good comments. The workers' comp area has become sort of the new front for workplace issues in the COVID era. What we're seeing are several states that are moving to implement some type of presumption that if an employee, and particularly employees on the front line, such as first responders and healthcare workers, contract the COVID disease that is presumed to be work-related, and therefore they're eligible for workers' comp benefits. In a nutshell, in the narrowest sense, that's not necessarily that troubling, but it does open the door to various other things which are not so pleasant to contemplate. basically it sets a standard that says these workplaces are hazardous. And as Matt can tell you, once you get a workplace described as hazardous, the plaintiff's bar is soon to follow. And so that's one of the reasons we don't like to see this happen. One of the things, this is happening in two different ways. So we've seen legislative action in some of the states like Illinois and New Jersey, and then we're seeing executive action in some of the states, notably California, where the governor issued an executive order. We've determined that executive order is legitimate, at least in the context of California. A little surprising, you would think an executive order couldn't override legislation, but the governor has broad authority in California to do that. In the legislative arenas, it's much more complicated and difficult to head off. So you can imagine that the legislatures of Illinois and New Jersey, being heavily Democrat-oriented, have little trouble pushing this through. And that would be, I think, the concern for Nevada, where you've got a similar political alignment. So I would put that as something that you all should probably be wary of happening. I don't see any activity in Nevada at the moment, but you never know when this kind of thing may emerge. If it does emerge, our advice is to basically push to keep it as narrow as possible to employees where you have a very clear exposure to the virus in the workplace, where there isn't any question that kind of, well, let's put it this way, where there's less question that a employee might be contracting the virus through their workplace, as opposed to so many other situations where the employee could contract the virus through other contacts, not at the workplace. So the basic concept is to keep it as narrow as possible. The other thing that has showed up, the other approach that we're taking is to suggest that instead of pushing employees into the workers' comp system, the better way to get them benefits is to push them into the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program that was passed by Congress in the CARES Act. And actually, that's more generous to the employees and doesn't put a strain on the workers' comp system, and actually is available to employees who have not, in fact, been unemployed or furloughed. So it's a much more flexible program and provides better benefits to the employees. And our recommendation to states that may be considering trying to do a presumption type of approach is to recommend that they use the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program as the way to get employees these types of benefits. I'm going to hold right there. I know other people have a lot of other stuff to talk about, so I'm going to let this flow on, and I'll be available as the questions come around in the back end.
Okay, Marc, thank you very much. I appreciate your comments. And next we'll go to Matt Webb. Matt is the Senior Vice President of Reform Policy for the U.S. Chamber Institute for Legal Reform. Matt oversees the development and advocacy of ILR's position and policy on key federal legal reform issues, including securities, litigation, preemption, alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, class action reform, tobacco Medicaid litigation, the False Claims Act, attorney-free shifting, shareholder activism, and campaign finance reform, if that wasn't enough. Matt, over to you next.
Great, thank you, Mary Beth, and thank you for having me today. So, as far as liability issues are concerned related to COVID, we're approaching this from four main what we call buckets of concern. Basically, exposure-related liability, issues related to medical liability reform, issues related to COVID securities litigation, and then finally products liability litigation related to COVID. And what we're trying to do is push Congress to enact federally preemptive legislation that would set a floor for liability protections related to those four key areas of concern. Where things stand right now is that Senator Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, has made it very clear that he is not going to be putting a phase 4 stimulus package, for lack of a better way of describing it, onto the Senate floor or to be considered unless there is strong liability reform legislation included as part of that overall negotiation package. On the exposure side of things, what we're pushing for is that if you as a business are in essence trying to do the right thing and make a good faith effort to comply with the appropriate health and safety standards, guidelines, regulations, etc., then unless the plaintiff was able to show by something along the lines of clear and convincing evidence or higher evidentiary standard that you were grossly negligent or worse, then you as that business would not be liable for any personal injuries that resulted from an actual or alleged exposure to COVID. So what we're trying to do is say that if a business is trying to do the right thing, they would be protected under the law. In the medical liability space, we're taking a similar sort of approach. That if you as a healthcare provider or healthcare facility also were not grossly negligent when you're caring for a COVID patient, or when you're caring for another patient and your care was impacted because of COVID, you also would receive appropriate liability protections. On the securities litigation side of the ledger, we're encouraging Congress to put in place basically a stay or pause on COVID-related securities litigation until after the health pandemic has passed. And then also a number of other reforms that are pretty technical in nature, but I'm happy to discuss those in more detail. And then finally, we're encouraging Congress to enact a series of expansions to the pre-existing PrEP Act, which deals with certain health countermeasures related to pandemics and making sure that the liability protections that statute provides be expanded to include things like hand sanitizers, personal protective equipment like gowns, also disinfectants that are approved by the EPA for dealing with COVID-related issues, etc. And we're also encouraging that if you as a Good Samaritan company are donating those sorts of supplies, then you would also receive the protections under that pre-existing statute. This is a challenging area. The trial bar is very active in pushing back against what we're advocating for. They're arguing that we're pushing for blanket immunity, and which is not where we are positioned. But also, I think at the end of the day, there's a very good chance to get some robust liability reform measures actually enacted into law related to COVID. As I said, Senator McConnell is working on a package and working very closely with Texas Senator John Cornyn. Senator Cornyn is very bullish on the prospects of there being an ultimate liability reform legislative package that will make its way to the president's desk. We're thinking that this is probably going to be a June sort of push as far as when the negotiations on what the phase 4 bill might end up looking like and what those liability protections would ultimately entail. But look forward to working with you and your colleagues at the in Nevada and Las Vegas, and working to try to get this stuff over the goal line. And happy to take any questions and get into more detail as you see fit.
Okay, Matt, thank you so much. And on that note, we will be taking some questions in just a few minutes. But next, we want to turn to Chamber Chairman Tom Burns. He's the president of Cragin and Pike Insurance, has been president since 2010. Tom regularly speaks on insurance issues and topics. And in addition to serving as the Chamber's chair, he is also on the Chamber's Government Affairs Committee. Tom, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're muted.
Tom, if you could, let's unmute your microphone, Tom. There we go.
There we go. Sorry about that. Thank you, Mary Beth. I'm really happy to be here. I echo a lot of the concerns that Marc brought up regarding presumptive liability, especially the manner in which it was administered in California. So you should know that your chamber has been in touch with prospective legislators and current legislators and have expressed that concern over the last couple of weeks. Also, we're in the process of opening up communication with the governor's office to have that very conversation. The thought of presumptive liability would put a tremendous strain on the workers' compensation system and could adversely affect a lot of businesses here in town from what they do. In addition, a lot of the gaming properties are self-insured, and that would be a large blow to a already struggling industry that supports our economy at such a high level. A lot of my other thoughts Marc has already echoed, and so I'll just leave it at that.
All right, great. Thank you, Chairman Burns. We appreciate your remarks. Next is Mr. Jim Wadhams with, he's a partner of Black and LoBello. Jim focuses his practice on government affairs, insurance, administrative law. He has presented issues in the legislature for public agencies in Nebraska and Nevada since 1981. He has represented private clients as a lobbyist before the Nevada legislature and does serve as a lobbyist working on behalf of the Vegas Chamber. Jim is a former commissioner of insurance in Nevada, and he and his son Jesse serve as outside state lobbyists, as I said just a moment ago, for the Vegas Chamber. Jim, you and I have had several conversations about this very topic, so I'm very happy to have you joining us today with your vast amount of expertise and experience. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mary Beth. Appreciate the opportunity to just add just a little local flavor. I think Matt and Marc have really laid out the concerns, the buckets of concern. I like that expression very well. In Nevada, we historically have had certain presumptions that have been created by the legislature in workers' comp, generally relating to police and fire on heart disease and lung disease. There has been a fair amount of discussion about that being appropriate in the hospital area and potentially other essential workers that have been active since the declaration of our emergency. Our governor actually, in an order that he issued, actually it was his directive on March, I don't have the right date, I apologize, issued a similar provision to what we're talking about for healthcare workers, that during the period of emergency, there is no liability other than something where you could prove by clear and convincing evidence gross negligence or worse. And so there is an opportunity for the governor to extend that level of protection across the board during the period of emergency. How long this emergency will be declared, we're not sure, and I'm fairly confident we will be dealing with this issue in the legislature in February, if not at a special session sooner.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Jim. We're going to go ahead and take some questions from our listeners and viewers today. As a reminder, you can ask a question one of two ways. First, you can do so by clicking the hand raise button on your interface. We will call your name and unmute your line so that you can ask your question, and then you can also ask your question verbally yourself as well. So we welcome that, and we encourage everybody to ask their questions. I do already have one here. I'm going to go ahead and read this because it's fairly specific. It's my understanding that workers' comp policy applies to where the employee incurs the injury or illness or home location, whichever is richer for the employee. It says, do we need to craft our policies to restrict employees from working from home out of state, such as California? If an employee, in other words, if an employee is working from home out of state, their choice, not ours, are we potentially on the line for workers' comp claims if they contract COVID out of state? And I'll open up that question to whoever wants to reply.
Yeah.
I nominate.
The short answer to your question, I believe, is yes. You know, part of the risk you take on employing somebody in another state is they have the right to choose the workers' compensation benefits in the state they reside, if those are richer. So that is part and parcel is what comes with hiring somebody that lives out of state.
Well, let me take a little bit of a different tack there, and let me begin by giving my typical disclaimer when we get into these conversations. I am not providing legal advice. Nobody should go forth and say, Feedman told me to do this. Please do not say that. This is an open discussion about various possibilities. The way I heard the question, it talks about the employee choosing where to do their work and the possibility that they would be contracting the disease from working at home in another state. If I'm listening to that, I'm asking the question, what were they doing to contract the disease, and how closely can you associate it with the work they were doing? If they're at home and they're in another state, they just happen to be at home and they do something that gets them the disease, but it's not work related, you may have an argument there. You certainly have less control over their conditions of work if they're working from home. And I guess I just say there's some questions to be answered in terms of determining whether they're eligible for workers' comp benefits in whatever state they happen to live in.
I would agree with that. I guess I presume we came to the spot where we assumed that they contracted in the course and scope of their work.
Okay. Anyone else want to weigh in on that one before we move on?
Right, Beth, this is Jim Wadhams. I think both Marc and Tom have made a couple very good points. The standard responsibility is for employees incurring a disease, in this case, in the course and scope and as an incident of their employment. And that becomes very complex if they're working from home. That's not typically within the employer's control as to the environment and the protection of that person. And that is an excellent question, one that's not, I don't think, really susceptible to a very clear answer until we get either a gubernatorial directive or some legislative directive, because we are in a new environment where many people are working remotely, as am I at this moment.
I think it's also going to be a very fact-specific inquiry. You know, what kind of work are they doing? How were they exposed? Did somebody bring it to the home from another source? You know, all kinds of specific variables that play into that question. It's an excellent question. I mean, certainly in the current environment, it's one that people need to be thinking about, but I don't think there's going to be a standard answer.
Yeah, we're getting that question a lot, and it appears to be a case-by-case basis. So another question we're getting a lot is from businesses who say, you know, if I'm following CDC, state and local guidelines regarding employee safety, right, and it's considered to be reasonable, would I still be open to liability or a workers' comp claim? And also, businesses are asking, should they have their employees sign waivers?
I'm going to defer to other people on this call as to whether a waiver would actually protect the company there. It is sort of a catch-22. You are supposed to be doing these things, but in doing these things, you're also sort of setting yourself up as establishing a standard of care. Let me put it this way. You can't not do these things. There's no argument for not taking these measures and doing everything you can. Whether you get full protection in a legal litigation context is going to be a difficult question to handicap. The basic workers' comp equation says that the employer is not at fault if somebody comes down with a disease or comes down with an injury. And by the way, whether this injury is compensable is another discussion. But there are ways that the plaintiff's attorneys have for getting around that in terms of establishing higher levels of knowledge. So I guess my basic answer is you have to do all these different protective measures. There's no argument for not doing them. It just may not give you absolute immunity from some type of litigation, legal question.
And I mean, from my perspective, I mean, there's also, I mean, that's one of the major reasons why we're pushing for a legislative solution here. Because if you are doing, I mean, as I mentioned in my remarks, doing the right thing, you should receive some level of protection under the law as far as liability for those sorts of exposures, be it from for a customer or passerby or visitor to your properties or from an employee. I mean, and then on the question of waivers, I mean, I don't think an employer can necessarily waive the protections or get the employee to waive the protections of workers' comp. That would be an interesting thing to litigate, but I think it would be very challenging to actually get a waiver like that to actually stick. But
I just want to add to what both Marc and Matt said. For employers, they can't be sued if the claim is under workers' compensation. That's the trade-off. It's a no-fault system, so there's no, the employer does not get sued. What our concern is I think Marc laid out at the beginning of his remarks, is we're concerned about a presumption that the claim came out of the working environment, as opposed to a wedding I went to or a party I went to down the street. And so we've got to be very careful. And I think the other question is compliance with guidelines that are put up by CDC in our states. That's what our U.S. Chamber is working on nationally. That's what we are encouraging our lawmakers locally to consider. If we're complying with what the scientists and health authorities have told us to do, that should give us protection for anything less than gross negligence.
Right, that's the message that Matt's been putting out.
Mary Beth, if I could contribute and ask another question to this. We have a lot of small businesses, obviously, that are watching and listening here. In what way, when you think about your employee handbook and your respective businesses, and Matt, you mentioned just doing the right thing, if that's reflected in your employee handbook, every business should really be going back through and revising their handbooks to, reflect this new era that we're in. But so I think that would be one thing, that just make sure you're doing that as a small business. But is there any linkages that you can advise on in relation to handbooks and the liability that members can look to a change or adjust for specifically?
well, I mean, I think one of the things to be careful here is also getting so wedded to a particular set of guidelines at a particular point in time, because as we've all seen, the guidelines from CDC, others in at the federal government, as well as at the state and local levels, have been somewhat shifting depending on what information they have at the time, and as far as the science develops related to COVID and what works, what doesn't work, what's a concern or not. So I think this is one of those situations where I would encourage everyone to be as flexible as possible, and realize that the guidelines are constantly in flux right now. That's one of the things that we've been pushing. At least from the U.S. Chamber's perspective, is that there needs to be some clarity from policymakers on what the right thing is to do, or things are to do or not do, as the case may be. So while it would be good to have in your employee handbook, I don't necessarily think that that's the be all end all of the discussion at that point, because as I said, we've seen the guidelines have been somewhat in flux.
Thank you.
Okay, Matt, any other comments on Scott's question? Moving forward, are there other states that have introduced legislation that could potentially be a good example for Nevada to follow? Anyone aware of it?
My basic feeling is no. If they're introducing legislation, it's generally not in the employer's favor here. And I say that as a very broad brush comment because there may be some bills out there that are narrowly tailored and, do not necessarily on their face create problems for the broad employer community. That's a good question, which we can do some looking into and see if we've got some examples we can send you.
And then on the liability side, there are a number of jurisdictions that have been looking either through legislation or through executive action to put in a number of protections for businesses and others, depending on that particular state's circumstances. At least from the U.S. Chamber's perspective, we have a number of what we're calling policy modules related to COVID liability issues that we're providing to state and local chambers, as well as state legislators and state governors' offices to encourage different types of liability protections that they might be able to put in place. So we're very, very happy to share those with you, and particularly for Nevada. So.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Here's another question. Can small businesses file a claim for reimbursement of business interruption losses? This has come up a lot.
Yes. So first of all, I'm going to highly encourage you to submit the claim. Okay. It's worth the effort. Most business policies have a virus exclusion on them, which excludes business interruption from pandemic. And there are a couple other exclusions that are often on property policies that would exclude it. But I would highly encourage you to turn the claim in. You have every right to do that. And if there's some federal backstop that comes along the way, you want to be in a position to be able to take advantage of that.
Okay, thank you very much, Chairman Burns. Marc or Matt, here's a question for either or both of you. How could potentially COVID-19 differ from how other diseases have been historically addressed in workers' comp or liability issues, especially when there is still a lot to learn on how this virus actually works?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch the full question. Can you run through that again?
Sure, definitely. In a nutshell, how could COVID-19 differ from how other diseases have been historically addressed? In other words, how we've addressed other diseases compared to COVID-19 regarding workers' comp or liability issues, especially when there is still a lot to learn on how this virus actually works.
Well, let me make a run at it, and I'm happy to have anybody else take their shots. It is a unique disease. As I've been talking about it, I don't think we've ever seen something with this universality that covers so many workplaces. That alone separates us from other diseases that have, been of high profile. I think there's also a certain environment around this disease that has got people much more aware of it and much more concerned about it than we may have seen in previous pandemic situations. But I think the questioner is right that there's still so much we don't know about how it's transmitted, or a lot of the different particulars about how it operates. So the answer is it's different than anything we've seen before, but I'm not sure how we compare it to anything we've seen before. Lots of talk about 1918 and the 1918 to 1920 or so flu epidemic. Well, we didn't have workers' comp back then. We didn't have a lot of things we have now back then. So there really isn't a good comparison or a way to say, this is how it differs. It's just it's something of a sui generis type of situation, I think.
Yeah, you're right. Chairman Burns regularly says they didn't send a manual along with COVID-19.
Not this time, maybe next time.
Yeah, I'm going to this question a lot as well, and this might be for Chairman Burns and also for Mr. Wadhams. If you're a new business and you still need to set up workers' comp, will there be another provision just for COVID put into the policies?
I'm not of the opinion there will be. Workers' compensation is set up to protect the worker. It is really as much a social animal as it is a financial animal. If you go back to 1918 when we didn't have workers' comp, a co-worker would have to sue another worker if they were injured as a result of their negligence. And so that wasn't a very good way for people to get their arms fixed if they broke their arm or broke their leg. And so the system was put together as much as a social animal to protect the worker from what happens at the workplace. And so I don't see that addresses the history of the product. Jim, what are your thoughts?
Tom, I totally agree with that, because the issue as you say, for workers' comp is, did I get this at work because of work, as opposed to playing in the park over the weekend or going to church last Sunday. And so it protects the employers and employees from having to sue to get benefits. So I don't think there's going to be a legislative change in whether that could be covered if I've obtained it from work. The risk is, going back to what Marc Feedman said, is we want to be very careful about creating a presumption that if I get this disease that has been so pervasive and easily spread, that I must have gotten it at work, which to me is really ironic when most of us have not been physically in a place of work for 8 or 9 weeks.
Okay. All right. We're also getting this question a lot of questions surrounding this topic. It's very, very popular topic, and a lot of people are very concerned about reopening their doors. What advice would you all give to employers who have employees who are known to not be observing or complying with social distancing, wearing the masks, and so forth? I see a lot of folks shaking your heads, so feel free to chime in.
There's a lot of public conversation about employers trying to protect their employees, et cetera. And I think the presumption is that the employees are following along. This question raises the other scenario. I don't have a good answer. And again, this is not legal advice, but my suggestion to any employer is to document. Make clear that you provided the PPE or the training or the facilities to wash the hands and do everything they're supposed to do. Make sure the employee acknowledges that you provided it. And you're trying to set up a defense that says if the employee comes back to me and claims that they got the disease at work, that they've acknowledged that I've done everything I was supposed to do. At that point, I'm not sure what else you can do, but I would just say this is a time when you really want to make sure you've covered your tracks.
And also from the third-party liability perspective, if you've got an employee or a group of employees who are not doing what they're supposed to be doing in order to protect your customers and others entering your facilities, you might be opening yourself up to potential liability from folks who are potentially exposed external to your business as a result of that. So I agree wholeheartedly with Marc. I mean, you need to document.
A certain suggestion of employee. Sorry.
Go ahead, Marc.
Embedded in here is the suggestion of employee discipline, and I don't know where to go with that. I mean, different employers have different approaches to reacting if employees don't follow safety programs. I mean, this is a constant problem even outside the COVID question. So, if you have a disciplinary path for an employee who disregards the safety requirements of the workplace, this would be a place where you would want to invoke that, or certainly make it clear to employees that what your level of tolerance will be for them not doing what you told them to do.
Yeah. Mary Beth, let me jump in if I can keep it straight in my mind on both comments by Matt and Marc. from the employee standpoint, I think you've got to make it clear with your employees that you do not want them. They are not permitted to come to work if they're sick. Now, you may need to make other accommodations, and I think that's part of what he's referring to, and I support that. But the best protection for all of my employees is that none of them report to work with coughing and pain in their chest or whatever the other symptoms are. The second element is the one I think that Matt raised, is particularly if you deal with any sort of a retail or external customer base, you don't want to expose those customers, because that is a system based upon liability. And if you have not, among other things, put the protection on your employees and discourage them, if not prohibited them from coming to work sick, then you have exposed your customers. And so I think what Matt and Marc have said is really a critical point for employers to pull out their manuals, pull out their business operating procedures, and take a very careful look at that.
The only problem, I guess, that I would add that would come in when you have a person who isn't presenting any symptoms, but they could potentially be, again, they're not compliant. Marc, did you have a comment?
No, that's the great X factor here, is that asymptomatic vector. And that's why you have to be so vigilant, and there's really very little margin for fooling around here. Mary Beth, I see a question that came in on the chat area about daily wellness checks and liability waivers, and I think this might be a time to talk about that. I know a lot of people, a lot of companies have done, ask their employees to go through a checklist every day they come in, or on a regular basis, and in some cases take their temperatures and those kind of things. I'm just going to say that I'm not a big fan of those types of employee checklists. I don't think they provide a lot of credibility. It's one thing for an employer to ask the employee how they're feeling and get them to go through a series of questions. An employer should regard that as one piece of information and not dispositive about whether the employee could be contagious. I mean, there are employees who will say whatever they have to say to come into work to earn money. I mean, let's face it. And so those types of situations, those types of checklists, I think, should be taken with a very, very, big grain of salt.
Okay, Marc, thank you. Any other comments on that particular question?
Mary Beth, I might add that we've had a fair amount of discussions about this, and that also as employers and for our small business members, you also don't want to generally put yourself in a situation where you are trying to diagnose anything yourself. So I just would reiterate that if you have an employee that is not feeling well or exhibiting any symptoms, that having a quick test at the office is not what you want to be doing. You really want to reiterate, send that employee to a medical professional right away, and not try and play doctor in any capacity as an employer.
So Scott, do you mean to give a specific example of that? You're saying, for example, if you're a non-medical facility, don't get into the business of taking people's temperatures when they walk in your door.
Correct. That's how we've been advised from an HR perspective, that you just don't want to be in that position from a decision-making or liability perspective. If there's any doubts, you just want to immediately be sending an employee to a medical professional.
Okay, this question is for Mr. Wadhams. Jim, do you foresee the possibility of a federal backstop similar to, say, TRIA, for example, to be created for business income claims that are pandemic related?
Well, I'm going to make a quick comment, and then I'll defer to our friends from Washington, D.C. I think there's definitely going to be some discussion of that, and that is a possibility. One of the major trade associations or insurance has said that there could be a system where that could be developed, but that generally speaking, it is a national problem. In fact, it's a global problem, and it's not really just a coincidence of what might be happening at work. So I think that's going to be a topic of discussion. And Matt and Marc, I'll defer to you on how far those discussions will go.
It is very much a topic of discussion in Washington right now. There are a lot of variables in this one, and I mean, and also to be very, very blunt, I mean, there are a lot of dollar signs associated with this one as well, and it's going to be a challenging one as to whether or not it can be put together. I think that there is interest in it, but I think it remains to be seen ultimately how Congress decides to deal with it, and also how they decide to fund it if they decide to go down that road. But this is an issue that the broader U.S. Chamber is very much engaged on.
We've also had a lot of questions about contact tracing, and I almost hate to put this out into the universe, but we've gotten this question: will it be incumbent upon the employer to institute contact tracing, do you think?
Let me just jump in on that one. I see almost nothing but problems for an employer in that role. And I'll couple this with the employee testing question, because that's another one that I don't think has gotten explored as deeply as it needs to be. Lots of people saying, oh, you got to test your employees, you got to test your employees. Well, which test do you use? How do you do it? Who pays for it? What do you do with the data? I mean, it just flows from there. And contact tracing, I think, I look at that and I say, you don't want your employer tracking your movements outside the workplace. That's just a very, very delicate proposition. If there's contact tracing that goes on, I think it has to be done outside the context of the employment relationship.
Thanks, Marc. Anyone else want to weigh in on that? Okay.
I would just, again, wholeheartedly agree that just going back to that mantra as a small business owner, don't play doctor in these capacities. Don't rely on your instant test that's in your medical kit. Utilize the medical network to determine these things.
Okay, agreed. I think we
Mary
did.
Beth,
Yeah.
Mary Beth, I'm sorry. Scott just triggered a thought. I wanted to just make sure the listeners all are aware or reminded of this. Under an order issued both, I think it's under the CARES Act and it's in Governor Sisolak's order that pertains to Nevada. Your health insurance companies will administer these tests without any expense to the employees. And so the suggestion of sending the employees to get tested, to get medical treatment, is not only a good business practice, it's consistent with what both the state governor and Congress have put into place to facilitate exactly that opportunity.
Okay, we have time for one, maybe two more questions. This one I think you all touched on earlier, but it's still coming up, so I want to give an opportunity to clarify this. If an employee is working from home and comes down with COVID-19, can they file a workers' comp against their employer?
Well, kind of coupling my point and Marc's point from earlier, can they file a claim? Yes, they can. And then there needs to be evidence that that claim was a result of work they did or activity they did in the course and scope of their work and not personal activity.
I would also throw in the variable of how the state treats that that type of claim. I mean, is COVID-19 a compensable injury? One of the sort of tough things to nail down on workers' comp is that it's a state-by-state system, and there's lots of variables in terms of what injuries are compensable, to what degree they're compensable, and all those types of questions that arise. So, unfortunately for your inquirer, there isn't a clean answer there. It really does relate to how close to the workplace can they claim that they got the disease, and is that something that's compensable in that state's workers' comp system?
Yeah, I agree with Marc, but I would encourage our employers, much like they shouldn't play doctor, they shouldn't play insurance adjuster either. If somebody makes an allegation,
well, that's their insurance thing.
Yeah, that's what your insurance is for. So rather than play insurance adjuster, turn it over to your carrier. It's their job to investigate it. It is their job to apply the state law as it's supposed to be applied. So please, you take on a lot of liability if you're wrong. So please turn it in and let your insurance carrier take care of that.
Okay, a lot of our members are very worried, and I know, Scott, yours are as well. And they're asking if there is currently any legislation to protect employers from any of these lawsuits. Any legislation that anyone's aware of?
Over to you, Matt.
Well, I mean, at the federal level, there are a lot of discussions related to legislation to help protect employers related to this type of litigation. As I mentioned during my comments, I mean, Senator McConnell and Senator Cornyn are probably going to have the leading legislation going through the full legislative process. And we know that there have been discussions with other members that are looking at doing things as well. The McConnell-Cornyn legislation has not been introduced as of yet, but it's just a matter of time. They're still working on getting it drafted. So there will be something moving through the legislative process. And then in various states, there are bills that are getting teed up for when the state legislatures come back into session after their COVID-related or COVID-imposed recesses.
Okay. I really want to thank everyone for being with us today. This about wraps up our time today. Matt Webb, Marc Feedman from the U.S. Chamber, Mr. Wadhams, it's always a pleasure to see you. Chairman Burns, thank you so much for being with us today. Scott Muelrath, it's been just an absolute pleasure working with you at the Henderson Chamber of Commerce. I applaud everything you do for your members, and I know we say this a lot, but we like each other. We're all in this together. So I'd like to hand it over to you to give some closing remarks for us today.
Well, thank you, Mary Beth. And I think I would simply close with that as our viewers, we appreciate you being members of the respective chambers, but know that on the advocacy front in the Vegas Chamber with Mary Beth Sewald, Paul Muradkin, great advocacy team on the Henderson side, myself, Amber Stidham, our Director of Government Affairs. We are watching all of these issues on the local, state, and federal level on behalf of our membership. And so we just want to reiterate that we are engaged on this subject. And as we move through our legislative process, the respective chambers are working together to advocate for these topics. So thank you, Mary Beth.
All right, that's great. Thank you all again for joining us today. Thank you all for being with us. We appreciate it. And do feel free to go to vegaschamber.com to sign up for the webinars for the rest of this week, and stay tuned for more information as always. Thank you all again, and have an amazing day.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, sir. Bye.
Yeah.